I'd just like to start by saying one comment on the previous talk just before the break. I was thinking with so many references to Berkeley Square of a concert that I went to. One of the times I saw Stefan Goodbody in concert. He recounted how in 1939, as a very young violinist, he had arrived in London with Django Reinhardt, and he was very excited at his visit to his first visit to London, and he went out at night to try and hear the Nightingale in Berkeley Square. So my topic is the conservation of Dublin's Victorian parks. I will be slipping the odd Edwardian park into that as well, I hope you don't mind. But I won't be saying an awful lot about the character of parks, which was down on the programme. My expertise would not really lie in the character of the planting and layouts of parks. I'd leave that to others. I'm more concerned with structures and buildings in the parks, though something to do with the layouts will be inherently in what I have to say about how we might protect and safeguard what's there in our parks. And I'm trying a new thing here, which is using yellow writing over photographs. Don't worry if you can't read it, because I really hope you're not going to just sit there and read it all, because I am going to say it. But there'll be a different park underneath each of the slides. But the first thing I want to just sort of make clear is the responsibility for parks. A lot of what I'm going to be saying here is self-evident, but it's no harm just for sake of neatness to say it anyway. Parks really come under a number of different headings. The most obvious one is the local council, the city, the town, the county. But there's also some parks in central government ownership, most of which would be looked after by the Office of Public Works. And we'll be seeing some of those as well. And we mustn't forget the private ones. We've heard about privately controlled or owned parks this morning, and they still make a very valuable contribution to our parks, most notably Fitzwilliam Square, but other ones like Eaton Square and Belgrave Square in Monkstown would come under that heading as well. And as we've seen in recent years, has come to the fore, is that the ownership of the land on which the park stands is sometimes not the same as the ownership of the park itself. And that's not an issue I'm going to address, but it's one you do need to be aware of, and it came to a head in Dartmouth Square. It came to a head also at the same time in Clonmel. Now, just to, for those of you who are not familiar with the way local authorities work, and many of you will be, so you'll forgive me if I run through this again, but for those of you who may not be familiar, it's quite important in relation to how local authorities work is to understand the structure, which by law is split into two very different groups. There's the elected members, the obvious ones, the ones that we go out every so often to vote for, the councillors, and there's also the manager of the county council, the city council, whatever. If you're talking about a business in a commercial field, the councillors you might think of as being equivalent to the board of directors, and the manager or the executive is directly answerable in all things. But it is not the case in local authorities. The councillors make decisions on what we might call strategic issues, and the manager has the legal function of making decisions on executive things. So the councillors, for instance, cannot, in a normal state of things, for instance, make a decision on a planning application. By law, that is the decision of the manager, not the councillors, though they can, of course, advise, lobby, and whatever else. In relation to parks, it is the manager's function for the day-to-day running of them. And in effect, the managers of the various counties delegate to assistant managers, and so you would find a parks department would be, in the smaller authorities, would be under control of the manager, but in the larger authorities there's likely to be an assistant manager who has the responsibility for the day-to-day running. to give a banal example of this, the elected members would make a decision every year on the budget, which might include a sum of money for the purchase of machinery for the Parks Department, but it would be not their decision as to whether or not to buy a new lawnmower. That would be done by the assistant managers within the budget constraints. So this responsibility has the knock-on effect for how things work in parks in relation to decision making. This is an extract from the Planning and Development Act of 2000. It's the bit that says that gives the planning authorities the power to put buildings on the record of protected structures. And it basically, the important bit is the bit I put in blue. Just before that it says that a local authority shall have a record of protected structures in its development plan. And then the bit in blue says, and shall include in that record every structure which is, in the opinion of the planning authority, of such interest. That means of the interests listed above it. Now, the important thing here is not, to me, not that they have the power to do this, but they have the obligation. For a start, Dublin City and the local authorities in the general Dublin area have always had listed buildings and more recently protected structures, but there were other local authorities around the country who never had listed buildings in the old days. Nowadays they have to have a record of protected structures. But the bit I've included in blue there, the word shall means it's obligatory, it's not an option. They shall include in that record every structure which, in their opinion, is of importance. One of the knock-on effects of this is that if a building is not on the record of protected structures, it is actually, could be argued, it's illegal for them to refuse planning permission to demolish it on the basis that it is of interest. If it's of interest, it should be on the record of protected structures. Now, the other thing that is not expressly said in that, but there is nothing in there that says these structures are to be included if they're in private ownership. It's all structures. So it doesn't say regardless of ownership, but I think we can take that as read, that gives them the power to protect any structure no matter who owns it. And that means if it's the state, if it's the local authority, or if it's private. So just want to run through what some of the local authorities in the Dublin area have put on their record of protected structures that happen to be within parks. And in many cases these structures are ones that would be protected whether or not they were in a park. But look at Fingal for a start. And we see 5 parks there in Fingal have protected structures in them. Many of which, like Ardgillan Castle and the Malahide Castle, obviously they're going to be protected structures one way or another. So a few of those issues are ones which are specific to parks, like a walled garden, an ice house, gates and piers. But so there's some things there in, well, all of those things there would be in the ownership of Fingal County Council. Looking at Dún Laoghaire Rathdown, again we find quite a number of parks with structures that are included in the record of protected structures. Some of them very park orientated, such as the Bandstand Pavilion and entrance gates to Blackrock Park, the Gate Lodge and the Pavilion in the People's Park in Dún Laoghaire. Then we see other ones in Killiney Hill Park, and ones like Moran Park House and Callanteely House, well, they're houses, they're not really park structures, they just happen to be in a park, as is Marley. South Dublin doesn't have an awful lot in its parks, but Corca Park has the ruins of a gunpowder mill, which isn't really a park feature, but happens to be in the park, so it's protected. The parks under the control of the Office of Public Works in Dublin City include a huge amount of protected structures. All the structures in the War Memorial Park at Island Bridge, which is in the photograph here, and an enormous number of structures in the Phoenix Park, including the gate lodges, but also gates and railings, and in the People's Gardens in there, which I've listed separately, you find shelters and a bandstand. Stephen's Green, which again is opposite Public Works, we see a lot of parks, structures, railings, gates, bandstand, the summer house, fountains and statues, as well as the superintendent's house. If we look at Dublin City, and I hope you can read that one, it's actually very little that's protected within the parks controlled by Dublin City Council. The top one on the list is the boundary railings to the park in Berkeley Road and Eccles Street, which is the one in the photograph, just opposite the Mater Hospital. St Anne's Park in Raheny, we have a well, we have a tower, the hollow walls, and we have the red stables. And then in Blessington Basin, we have the lodge, the gardens, the railings, and the walls. But that's not really an awful lot. Just divert here to have a look at that glorious little lodge in Blessington Basin, and just to show that more recently than that photograph was taken, the little panel on the gable has the lodge 1811 in it. Now, all the architectural historians in the audience can decide amongst themselves whether that building dates from 1811. This is just a list of some of the parks controlled by Dublin City Council that have no protected structures in them. And by in them, I include the railings and the gates as well as in the squares. So to list them all: Marion Square, Mountjoy Square, Parnell Square, Pearse Square, Fitzwilliam Square, Dartmouth Square, Herbert Park, St Patrick's Park, and the all-important, etc., etc., etc. Now, there's probably a very good reason, or quite possibly a very good reason, which is there's not an awful lot in them that is worthy of protection in terms of structures. And I think that is just a list of parks, is not a condemnation of anybody for not doing something. You actually think about a lot of these, there isn't actually very much in the way that you would find, for instance, in Stephen's Green. But the photograph of St Patrick's Park, and we see nice little stone fountains at the extreme left and extreme right of the photograph, would be just two of the objects which maybe consider for protection. Apart from protected structures, architectural conservation areas is a very realistic way of protecting parks, because it's more than just the structures, it's the whole ambience of the place, the whole character. In Dunleary, Rathdown, the People's Park in Dunleary is an architectural conservation area in its own right, and in the other ones listed there, they're as part of a larger architectural conservation area into which these parks happen to fall. And within those areas, depending on, each one writes its own rules in each architectural conservation area, but it's likely to include the protection of various structures. And the rather delightful gates at Eaton Square in Monkstown that have the name in wrought iron on them would be protected by way of being in an architectural conservation area. In Fingal, we have ACA's architectural conservation areas in Ardgillan, Newbridge and Malahide Castle, protecting those three domains. And all three of them are very large, substantial domains with a lot of features in them. South Dublin would have no significant parks in any of their architectural conservation areas. Dublin City has a number of them. The Parkland at Marino Casino, the Dartmouth Square, which is the one in the photograph with its pergola, Prospect Square, De Courcy Square in Glasnevin, Great Western Square just off the North Circular Road, and Fitzwilliam Square. So, although in many of these cases you wouldn't find any protected structures in those particular parks, the fact that it is an architectural conservation area is more than likely will mean protection for any of the structures that are in there. Each architectural conservation area is based on a report written which defines its character, and that report will come up with the criteria for protection. So it doesn't necessarily follow that a structure is protected as a result of being in an architectural conservation area, but more than likely it would be. And then the question is, how effective is putting something on the record of protected structures or in an architectural conservation area? The top line I put, well, if it's a private sector, it's very effective. Very effective in if the local authority is prepared to take action to ensure that nothing gets destroyed or damaged in any way. But as far as protection for state-owned or local authority-owned structures, well, it's a thorny issue because it's where a local authority is being the judge and jury in its own case. If one of the departments does something, does the other department then take it to the High Court? I doubt it. But let's not look at it in terms of punishments for doing something wrong, but to how to ensure that whatever it is doesn't happen in the first place. By putting a building on a record of protected structures or by creating an architectural conservation area, you are automatically drawing attention to features of interest. And that in itself is a protection. The whole system allows for public participation, as in both cases with a development plan or an architectural conservation area, there is a public display which allows the public to have an input and comment. So if people out there know something that wasn't picked up in the development plan or in the ACA report, then there's an opportunity to point it out that some great historic significance or some feature that had not been understood and may not have been protected. But the bottom line is that local authorities are not supposed to contravene their own development plans. So if a building is or structure is protected, then it is actually contravening the Planning Act if anybody does in a local authority destroys that. But just the example of the structure here in the background, it's a concrete shelter. It's in the People's Gardens in the Phoenix Park. And that's the kind of structure that if it should deteriorate into a particularly bad condition, it would be very easy for somebody to sweep it away and not actually understand that that structure is of such architectural significance that it is a protected structure in its own right. So it's a case of drawing the attention of those who make decisions to the importance of a structure or a landscape. And so that's just a summary of what I've said before as to how things can be protected, and that the making the decision makers aware of the importance of something is the critical issue, because people sometimes would genuinely not be aware of the importance of something. I just want to finish up by going through very rapidly a few photographs to illustrate the points I've been making, and just to show some of the things mostly positive that have been happening in parks. But just start with structures that may be in parks and are not protected at the moment. The one on the left is a gas lamp standard from Blackrock Park, which isn't in amongst the things that are listed for protection in the park. We have the fountain, the drinking fountain in Herbert Park up at the top. Herbert Park is not an architectural conservation, or that structure is not listed. And then there's parks, railings and things in general, and we saw what happens in wartime to railings. Whether they were, if they'd been protected in London during the war, whether they would have been saved is another matter. This is a photograph of Pearse Square off Pearse Street, showing this great expanse of concrete and tarmac, and I'm delighted to say that that is no more. It's now reinstated into the form that it probably was originally. I say probably. It's based on the map on the left there, which shows it in 1847, though my guess is that that map is wrong, because you look at the shape of the road, it's quite different, the northern bit of it, and I think the map on the left was done before the thing was fully laid out, and that it hence was that interior design there in 1847 and was later swept away by the end of the century, or was the one on the right the original layout? It doesn't matter. It's been turned into a fabulous garden. There's another one, pretty desolate space. You can date the photograph by the burned out building dead centre in the middle and the back. Photographs taken the 1st of February 1972, when for the first time in a long time the people of Dublin could trespass into Merrion Square through the broken down railings. Well, that park has been transformed since from a very boring piece of area to part of it is now an urban forest. I presume deliberately, but there's incredible density of trees in parts of Merrion Square, and you get light into it in February, but what it's like on a dull day in say September, October would be another matter. But of course much of it is open in the middle, and that's probably closer to the previous photograph. That's another one, that's the Royal Hospital, which now looks like that. A bit of an improvement, I think. And here we see parks being restored to the way that they were originally, which is just wonderful. And the structures generally refurbished while they're at it. That's the People's Park in Dún Laoghaire as it is today, and the original 2 fountains and the bandstand surviving intact in the middle of it. But actually the path layout is quite different. If we see a photograph from when it was laid out in 1890, and so shortly after that the photograph is taken, it's a very different layout of paths. It's my understanding Dún Laoghaire Rathdown intends to reinstate the original layout, which would be quite nice to go back to. I'm just going to finish on a comment which is not really anything to do with what I'm supposed to be talking about here, but you look at signs like that, and signs I mentioned this morning telling you what you couldn't do. They always tell you what you can't do. It's a lovely piece of metal sign, but it's all negative, negative, negative. Isn't it much nicer to have one like that? So that's, thank you very much for giving me your attention.